Turning now back to the scriptures, I do want to start off again with a question, as is my habit, and I'm going to forewarn you, I will insert another question midway through. So there will be two questions this morning. Buckle up. But the first question I'm going to ask is, if you had God's power, the God who set the foundations of the world, or as one of my favorite ways that the genie in Aladdin puts it, if you had phenomenal cosmic power in your itty-bitty living space, what would you do with it? If you could do anything in the world, what would you do? What's that? Just one thing, just one thing. You could give yourself more wishes if you want, Jane. What was that? Heal all sickness. A worthy thing. What were you thinking, Becca? Something maybe more personal? Yeah. You are a content bunch of people. Too many things. I'm okay to wait. Oh, big hand over here. Ice cream. Also worthy. Infinity ice cream. Yeah. Healing broken relationship. David. 1,000 wishes. Yeah. We would do so many things, right? If we could do whatever it is and we had the power to do whatever we wanted. And this is really what Job is asking God to do. If you are just and good and holy and righteous as we say you are, then why don't you come down and fix the injustice in the world? It's a pretty common question that we all have. Why are there sick people? Why can't everything happen the way we want it? Why is ice cream limited? Seriously, why is it limited? It's wild. And I think I remember, I don't know when I asked this question, but it was in my childhood, thinking, when I'm old enough, I'll go to bed whenever I want, and I'll eat ice cream whenever I want. And it just doesn't work that way. Not if you want to be healthy anyways. But as we look to the back half or the latter parts of Job, I think it is helpful for us to do maybe just a quick review so that the conclusion makes some sense to us. Job's story, as we talked about in the very first week, is an invitation to conversation. The whole premise of Job and why it's written is for community discussion. This was given to the community as a way of inviting everyone into dialogue with each other. Let us talk about the nature of life and how God interacts with us. What assumptions do we make, and how do we process those assumptions when they let us down? How do we hold to the goodness of God when we suffer, or when we experience death, or when we experience illness, when we lose someone that we love, when our jobs aren't so great? And so into this conversation we've come, and we know from the very first moment of Job that this is not about whether or not he's a righteous person. Whatever happens to Job in the following chapters, it is clear from the onset in this conversation that this isn't about how good Job is, but we will have to wrestle with what it means for bad things to happen to someone good, right? That's the invitation. That's how we start. For me, this very much mirrors Pacha in The Emperor's New Groove. I don't know if you've seen The Emperor's New Groove, but essentially it starts out with someone coming to ask for good things, and they're immediately put into trial after trial after trial with someone who just is constantly questioning, can this man continue to be good even though he is betrayed, even though his way of life is threatened, even though his family is threatened, even though I want to destroy his life? And Pacha's goodness just continues to show up, and he continues to wrestle, and you see him question with every fiber of his being whether or not it is right to continue to be righteous. This is the story of Job, the emperor's new groove. But not Cusco, Pacha. And Job, when stricken with loss, when he loses his house and his fields of cattle and camels and donkeys and oxen, when he loses his children and his future and his hope, he mourns. And his friends come alongside of him, and at first they do all of the right things. They tear their clothes and they cover themselves in ashes and they grieve. But then they begin to accuse him of being unrighteous, because surely he deserves it. They make this link, this theological link, between Job's circumstances and his righteousness. And I think how often we make similar judgments upon people. How often do we say, that's so difficult and I'm so sorry for you, but what did you do wrong to deserve this? We may, in our more extreme examples, drive by those who are without homes, or who have addiction, or who suffer physical or mental ailments, and wonder to ourselves, what wrong did they do? Why are they in this undeserving place? And like Job's friends, we moralize and we say, you must have done something wrong to deserve this. We don't help, like Job's friends don't help. They don't give him a job. They don't build him a house. They just tell him, you must be broken inside, and that's why your outside reflects so poorly. What windy comforters they become. We hold on to this idea that good people are blessed and bad people are cursed. And Job is looking around and saying, in what world do we live that this is true? Are all the billionaires good people in the world? As we look around, I will ask you, are all the billionaires good people? No, it's pretty obvious that some of them are pretty terrible humans. And is everyone poor, lacking in righteousness? Also no. And for some of us, that should be good news. That you are not your circumstances. Your righteousness is not directly correlated with the outcomes in your life. And so, if you're in an abusive place, if you're in a terrible place, you are free to leave those places. That's some of what Job is wrestling with as we move through the book. And over the course of dialogue that Job is having with his friends, it becomes more and more clear these two things: that the unrighteous sometimes prosper and the righteous sometimes suffer. It doesn't fit into a box. It is not what we want. It is not what we would have if we had all of God's power. Our wisdom is limited, and we are perplexed. I think it is fairly easy for us to find ourselves having the same conversation that Job is having without needing to lose all of our children and our house collapsing and our car breaking down and our jobs disappearing. What a great gift the book of Job is to invite us into this heavenly conversation, this cosmic conversation, without necessarily needing to go through all the suffering. And the central question in the middle of Job to us is your piety dependent upon your circumstances? When you look in the mirror, are you able to say, I want to be faithful to God only because you'll be blessed? Or do you want to be faithful to God because it is the right and good thing to be and to do? It's a really difficult mirror to hold up. But if you remember from week 1, this is a book written during a time of captivity for Israel. Think of Israel wandering or suffering under the rule of Egypt, wandering in the desert. Or think of Egypt under Assyrian domination. Or think of Egypt under Babylonian rule. Are their circumstances related to their righteousness? This is the conversation that they are having as religious, as those who are loved by God and who are called to witness. Are they faithful only for the jewels in their crown when they get to heaven? And are we faithful only because we think it'll mean a job promotion or head ushership at church or whatever it is that people fight over? I mean, these are real things, right? You think, I deserve this because I am good. And we take on maybe this attitude that if we put a quarter in the machine and turn the knob, that God will deliver the gumball of blessing to us if we're just righteous enough and we have enough righteous coins in our pockets. And so we wrestle with this idea as we move through the book of Job. And we wrestle with, like Job's friends, how we cast judgment on everybody else's circumstances. As you read through Job, and especially the section right before the place where we are in Job 38, where God answers, you sort of get this picture of friends who just want to pile accusations on Job. And for me, it's a really convicting section of Scripture. Because I know that I have cast judgment on others. And I know that I have thought someone deserved what they've gotten. And maybe it's true, and maybe it's not. But I am placing myself in God's position when I do that. I am allowing myself to take on this cosmic perspective of what is good and what is right. And I have become, at times, a windy comforter, wishing to assign my morality to your circumstances. Is this not the same conversation we're having in our political discourse these days? And Job's friends say many things, but they do very little. And so then we get to the portion of Scripture that we read this morning, where Job encounters God in a storm. In all of the metaphorical chaos of Job's life, God begins to answer Job. And so we'll pause, and I will ask another question. In books or movies or songs or poems, what is your favorite moment of realization? And I'll give you an example. And I'm old, so pardon me for the dated example. Not as old as some, but I am old. There's a movie called Good Will Hunting. And it's very quotable. And I quote it all the time to my children, and they have no idea what I'm referencing. But I quote it anyways. But in this movie, there's a scene in which the main character, Will, is with his therapist. And he's talking about all of the difficult things that have happened to him. And his therapist has read his file and knows that he's been in and out of family care, in and out of care with foster parents. He's had some really difficult things done to him, and just things that were out of his control. And his therapist grabs him and gives him a huge, tight hug. And he just says, "It's not your fault, Will." And with tears streaming down his eyes, he says, "I know." And he knows the kind of knowing where you know it up here in your head, that you can't logically sort of explain what's happened to you, but you know that it's not right. And his therapist is giving him a hug so that he knows it in here, that it's not his fault, that all of these things were out of his control. They weren't dependent on whether or not he was righteous enough as a child to deserve the things that happened to him. And there's this really powerful moment where it moves from him knowing up here to him knowing in here. That's one of the most powerful examples of a moment of reckoning or a moment of realization. And it's, for me, parallel to what happens to Job. So I'm going to ask you, what are your favorite, or what are some examples of moments in movies where a moment of reckoning happens and it moves from understanding in here, in your head, where you can logically make the argument, to that person realizing that it's really, really true in their heart? I have one more pocket example if nobody goes. Yeah. Into the Spider-Verse. What happens? When Miles Morales gets the courage, right? He understands that the abilities and him are the same thing. And then he just can be himself, right? He can fully be. He can actualize what it means to be Spider-Man. Great example. Yeah.
I can't remember how the scene totally plays out, but
Shawshank Redemption.
When Morgan Freeman comes to the end and has to make that crucial decision if he's going to stay living there.
Yeah. Should he walk out and find the tree, find his friend? Yeah. You have to watch the movie. I would actually recommend that movie. It's worth watching. Not a spoiler time. Yeah.
So, last episode of Breaking Bad, Walter White is talking to his wife.
Mm-hmm.
Admits to her, and comes to a realization, admits to her that he did all that stuff, being the messy kid, not because he wanted to take care of his family, but because he was good at it.
Mm-hmm. Walter White wanting to be good at something more than he wanted to be moral. Yeah, what an inward, reflective moment as he sits in the bottom of that pit. Yeah. One more. Yeah. Mulan, when she realizes that her dad is too old to go to war. Yeah. And she takes up the mantle of the family and takes on the responsibility of caring for the household. Yeah. Anyone else just bursting with one? Yeah.
I'd say
Saving Private Ryan.
At the very end, where Ryan, he knows that they're bringing him in and they want to bring him back to America. If you don't, I won't spoil anything, but I try not to. But they're trying to bring him back to America. A lot of bad things happen. He's like, this isn't fair that I need to go home and all my brothers, military kids, just died.
Yeah.
Stay here, help fight.
Yeah, taking on the responsibility personally because he knows his family has suffered tragedy. And should they suffer less? And should he be more blessed because of his circumstances? Yeah, there's a real moral moment where he wrestles with the gravity of the moment and his own personal role in that. I will end up sharing my second one. I didn't think I would, but I love it too much. There's a movie called A Day Without a Mexican. And it's essentially wrestling with the idea of sort of this underclass of economics that we have in the U.S. And so essentially what happens is the rapture happens and everyone who's Mexican gets caught up into the Lord's presence. And there's no housekeepers, there's no nannies, there's no field workers. And like people are just wrestling with like, how do we take care of ourselves? How do we eat? How do we do all of these things that we've sort of relied on this depressive economic stratus to do? And there's this woman and she's in the hospital and she's not caught up into the air with God. And she's really questioning her own righteousness. And she's talking with her family, and it's revealed that she's not Mexican by birth. And she says, but I'm Mexican in my heart. And then the next moment, she's gone. Because she's truly Mexican, not just genetically so, but like her personhood is Mexican. Anyways, it's a comedy, but it's really wrestling with some hard stuff. But it's the same sort of moment that happens, and I would also recommend that movie. But it's that same sort of moment that is happening here in Job, where a realization is moving from his head to his heart. And God answers Job this way: where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? He begins to put Job's circumstances into a much bigger context. And Job is immediately repentant. Even though he's already a righteous man, he says, God, I'm so sorry. I have heard with my ears, but now I see with my eyes your glory and your splendor, and how complex life really is. Who am I to take your place and your authority and tell the world how to operate? And God just sort of pours on these lists of questions, the 11, 14, 16, 32, depending on how you count the questions and their descriptions. But he goes on, not just in the section that we read, it's probably 4 times that length in God's response, where he talks about the light and the dark. How can we compare our circumstances to the mere existence of light? What is our place in the universe? He compares Job's circumstances to the seas and the mountains, to the springs and the deserts, to snow and to hail and to lightning and to frost, and to the places where water is so frozen it is hard as a rock. He compares Job's position to the mere existence of the heavens. And there's some really big things that are hard for us to wrap our minds around. And if you've ever sat on a mountain or in a valley underneath the stars and just felt how small we really are, it moves from our heads to our hearts, that we are but a speck in all of creation. And yet our expectation is for God to move on our commands. And it moves again to a different place of understanding. But just in case Job's little mind can't handle it, he brings it to things that Job might be more familiar with. He talks about the wild donkeys and the beasts of the field. And Job can't even control them, or the flowers of the field, or the streams. He did not carve the valleys that he lives in, or the mountains that he climbs. He can barely turn over, and I love this from the passage that we read, he can barely turn over the clay to make it a seal. God is trying to help Job experience life in all of its chaos and all of its beauty. It is not Job's fault that Israel was born, or that he was born to Israel in a time of oppression, nor is it his blessing that he could have been born in a time of prosperity. These are just the circumstances of Job's life. And when we are able to pull apart our morality from a direct correlation with our circumstances, we are free then to see that God is with us in every circumstance. And that is the hammer and the nail of Job. That our circumstances are not who we are. And that God loves us in every circumstance. That God is faithful to be near to us in every circumstance. Calamity that's described in the story of Job is not meant to demoralize us or to strip us from our motivation to be good and righteous. It is to help us see that sometimes the rain falls and the floods come and we are swept away in whatever happens. But without those things, there is no Nile, there is no fertile valley, there is no sustenance. And it's hard for us to see God's goodness when the rain is falling. But there is no way for life to exist without it. There is no one who has ever lived that has not experienced a storm of some kind or a hardship of some kind. There is no one evil who has not experienced goodness and love of some kind. A parent who nurtured and raised them. We can look around and see the obvious, but what we know up here and what we know in here can sometimes be so far apart that we want to stand in the middle and be God and say, if only God would punish that person and bless this person, all would be well, because all would be the way that I see it. And the admonition here is to recognize that God is good because God is near, that we do not exist without God's chaos, without the chaos of creation, that we do not have mountains without volcanoes, that we do not have seas without waves, that we do not have crops without rain. And we might wish it otherwise, but that is not the case. There is a lot of theology going on in the book of Job, and there is a lot of questions that remain unanswered, and God does not answer them, or at least not fully. But God does invite us into God's presence, and God does not reject our questions, and God does not scold us for passionately asking for God to make things right. But God does reveal God's presence. And I think there's something to this idea of Job that maybe God would overwhelm us with everything else that we might not be able to understand. And so when calamity comes, or when blessings come, can we be faithful? Job's story challenges any simplistic view that we might want to hold on to of what God should do or what we should deserve. There is no prayer of Jabez that guarantees we will be blessed. There is no job that you can have that guarantees you will not have problems, that you will not get sick, that your children will not suffer. There is no place on earth where storms will not come. And even though God is answering, we're left to wrestle with the truth that evil people will be blessed and righteous people will suffer. But God is trying to say that the way that the world works is not always linear, and that God is drawing us and the world into peace. And it may not be in a timeline that we understand or control, but God can still be drawing us to shalom. And our circumstances are not a direct reflection of our righteousness. And whether or not you like it, Job ends in a very comical way. Job is given 7 sons and 3 daughters. Job's cattle and donkeys and camels are replaced twofold, and his house is expanded. And we're left with this stupid temptation to make all the same simplistic, moralistic conclusions that we just were told are not good guides for life. It's a comedy when you read it from the beginning to the end, because it starts with Job was a righteous man and the righteous will be blessed, but then the righteous are cursed. But it ends with the blessing. And I very much want it to be that way for me. And I want it to be that way for you. That if you're just faithful through a few storms, God will bless you twofold. And the temptation remains for us to just hold on to the end of the story and to never live through the timeline of Job's life, to never put ourselves in the position of Job's sons or daughters or his donkeys or his camels, and to only want to be Job, for whom it all ends well. We want to be the town crier, ringing the bell, all's well that ends well. And it is written for us to sort of be smacked in the face. At the time that it was written and read and discussed the most in ancient Israel, everyone got it. All of the scholars and all of the people who would have read it would have understood the sarcasm of this ending. It is not written to tie a tidy little bow on the end of Job's life. It is written so that you're confronted again, even with the happy ending, to wonder and to question, will he lose it all again? Why are his friends equally blessed? Why does the person with 1,000 cattle next door also have what Job has? All of the same questions remain, and it is not his circumstances that testify to his righteousness. It is God's presence in his life, that he can be with God in the good times and in the bad.